Hello everybody, welcome back to Alan Wall's Photography. I am Alan and we are still in the Lightroom tutorial series, but we're up to video number 6. In video number 6, we're going to take a look at a couple of things that you can do in Lightroom. One that you're going to use all the time, and one that you may use only infrequently, but they're both important and they're both fun to understand. The first one is we're going to be looking at split toning, and this is the one that you're probably only going to use from time to time, while the second, the detail panel, which is where we do our sharpening and noise reduction, I think you're going to be using this one a lot. But we'll start with split toning. Split toning is a computerized version of what photographers used to do in their dark rooms. They would mix different, I don't know anything about making photographs by hand. Never messed with it. I'm sure I would poison myself or burn the house down. But anyway, they'd mix different chemicals and add different solutions to their photograph while it was developing to create a second kind of photograph within the first. It would create the sepia tone look that you see in a lot of old photographs, as well as the bluish selenium tone, I think it's called, and cyanotype. That might be the bluish one. But these are old techniques that were done when we developed our own pictures, or they developed their own pictures. And what this program does is it emulates that. It allows us to do it digitally. Now, when I first started learning about split toning years ago, I only ever did it with color photographs, and I would use it to do what I'm getting ready to show you here. But it's also super interesting to use with black and white pictures, so we'll look at that in just a second. But when you're doing color photography, and in this case we have a picture of some kind of a boat, a little square boat that frankly does not look like it should be able to even float, but it is. That's pushing a big barge up the river. And this was shot late in the evening. And I think it was shot at, no, it was shot at a low ISO, but it was as the sun was setting. And what I want to do is I want to use split toning to create one kind of tone to the color in the highlights and a completely separate color in the shadows, to kind of accentuate the whole look of the sunset in the evening. And the way I would do that would be to take the hue slider in the highlights and slide that into this area on the far left. It's the numerical value is going to be anywhere from 17 up to maybe 50. And if you want to see what the actual color you're getting ready to put on the highlights, if you hold down the Option key or the Alt key on your computer when you're moving the slider, it will give you a preview of the color you're going to be adding to the highlights. So in this case, I want to add a golden sunset hue. See, that's way too red. That's getting close, and then it gets too yellow. I think I'll shoot for something maybe right around there. 42, that sounds good. Now, when I was holding down the Option key, what Lightroom did was it pumped the saturation up to 100% to show me the color. But when I'm not holding the Option key, we get to set the saturation where we want it. And the more we saturate it, the more that yellow-orange color is going to show up in the photograph. So we don't want it anything like that much. This is a subtle addition to the photograph. So I think maybe I will bump it just until I start to see it reflecting in the windows and on the highlights up at the top of the boat. Okay, so that's That's the first half of how you do this. The second half is we have to adjust the colors in the shadows. Now, normally what works best is to give the shadows a bluish cast. Of course, it depends on the picture and it depends how late in the day it is and what kind of feel you're trying to get. But we do the same thing. We hold down the Alt or Option key, grab the slider, and then slide it towards the right until you see the tone that you want your shadows to be. Remember, Lightroom is pumping up the saturation here to 100%. It won't look anything like this when I let go of the Option key. Now I want it bluish, but I don't want it to look purple, and I definitely don't want it to look green. So a number usually around 220 should do. Let's leave it there at 216. Now let's take the saturation and increase that until we start to see that blue showing up in the shadows down around the bottom of the boat. Once that's done, we can use the balance slider to decide which hue we want to favor in the photograph. By that I mean, if we slide the slider all the way to the left, it's going to make the photograph blue because it's not really showing us any of the color change we made in the highlights. And similarly, if we slide it all the way to the right, it's going to make the whole picture yellowish orange because we're not showing any of the shadows. So what we want to do is figure out just how much of each we want. And usually for a sunset picture like this, I'll nudge it up to around 40, maybe 50, sometimes a little bit higher, so that the photograph is favoring the highlights and accentuating the orange colors and just adding the slightest hint of blue in the shadows. And that's about where I'd leave it. Let's see what that looks like. I think that's quite nice. It adds definitely more of a sunset feeling to the picture. Even the bubbles of water behind the boat are picking up a little bit of that yellowish hue from the sun. So that's how I use split toning when I'm editing color photographs. Let's see if we can find something black and white to try our hand at. All right, we got this chap on his telephone, and we're gonna do several different things to create several different looks. The three of the main processing tricks that photographers used to use consisted of the cyanotype color change, which is where the photograph has a blue cast, and the sepia is another one that is very common with the brownish cast in the shadows. So what we're going to do is we are going to apply those colors in the black and white photograph in the shadows. We're not going to do anything with the highlights. We're going to leave the highlights exactly where they are. And let's start out with the cyanotype. That's the bluish aqua tint. Now again, if we hold down the Option key and slide the shadows slider to the right until we get to right about 200, yeah, right between blue and that aqua color. Let's say 197. Why not? That looks good. And then, of course, when I relieve the pressure on the Option key, the 100% saturation goes back to 0. So now we have to slide the saturation up just to the point that it's giving us the effect that we want. And I think for me, it's right about there, 55%. And that is literally all there is to adding that bluish color to your black and white photograph. If you move the balance towards the left, favoring the shadows, you'll bring in a lot more of that blue. So I would leave it pretty much dead center at 0. I can never get it to stop on 0. If you double click on balance, it'll go to 0. And of course, if you move the slider to the right, none of the effect will be present, because by doing this, we're favoring the highlights. So we'll just leave it on halfway with our hue on 197 and our saturation on 55. And I think that gives a very believable cyanotype coloring to the picture. Okay, the next one is the sepia one. Let's look at that. We'll return all these to where they were. It's the same idea. In the sepia tone, we're going to work with the hue and the shadows once again, and by holding down the Option key, we'll get a preview of it. Now, sepia is kind of brownish, so it's going to be close to the orange area. I find usually about 35 to 40 works pretty well. It's nice and subtle. That looks good. Of course, we let go of the Option key, it snaps back to 0 on the saturation, so we now need to add back the saturation to get the amount of effect that we want. And again, it's right about 55% where I think it starts to look good. And we can accentuate it with the balance slider, or we can lessen it by going to the right with the balance slider. Let's just leave it right smack in the middle. So one of the other clever things that photographers used to do was a selenium treatment. And that's adding a rich brownish, reddish color to the very shadowy parts of the image. And it was used, I understand, primarily to make up for a green tint that was in the paper that they were using. I personally would have just got some paper that was white, but nobody asked me, and I don't know how to do that stuff. So that's the look, though. It's this accentuated blacks and a reddish hue in the shadows. And to get it, it's exactly what we just did. Click the Option key, grab the shadows slider. That tells Lightroom to pump up the saturation to 100%. And then we can just nudge this up pretty much no further than maybe 10 or 11. Let's try 12. And then when we slide the saturation to the right, we get as much of the effect as we want. And I'll slide the balance a little bit towards the left to accentuate that. And frankly, I don't see a whole lot of difference from the sepia, to be honest, but that's what you can do with black and white photographs. Experiment with it and see what kind of good looks you can get from it, or weird looks, if that's more your thing. But that's it. That's it for split toning. They're the times that I use it. Rarely for something artistic or a place you can. I've used it before in product photography when I'm trying to make a statement with colors. I've used the split toning to create odd effects that you'd have a hard time doing with the lighting itself. But anyway, let's close that down. That's enough on split toning. Consider yourself educated on split toning. The next place we're going to go is the detail panel. Now, this is an area that causes a fair amount of confusion. There are two halves to the panel. There is the sharpening half and the noise reduction half. And the reason they're on the same panel is because the two are inextricably linked in your photograph. As you add sharpening, you add noise. And as you add noise, you need to apply some degree of noise reduction. Now, every photograph has noise. You can't avoid it. But you don't need to try to get rid of all the noise. Some noise is actually part of the photograph and it gives the image a texture sometimes. But the fact is that all photographs have some noise in them. And that's because of It's because of the way the camera handles light and some of the filtering that goes on inside your camera to prevent aliasing and other things. But listen, let's first talk about the whole process of sharpening. Let's go to something more sharpenable. Well, you can sharpen pencils all day long, can't you? So let's take this picture of colored pencils on a white background as an example for the sharpening. The first thing you need to do when you're looking at sharpening a photograph is zoom in. That's what this exclamation mark is for, is telling you zoom in so you can see what you're doing. And yeah, there's a fair amount of detail in there, but we might want to clean up the sharpening. And what is sharpening? Sharpening is contrast at the edges of your subject. And remember, edges aren't just the primary edges here, but every little shred of this wood at the end of the pencil is also presenting you with many edges. This is an edge as well. Sharpening just tweaks the contrast at that edge. And how much you apply is very much a matter of taste. But the more you apply, the more other problems you have a tendency to add into the photograph. Now, remember that we're dealing with raw photographs. What your JPEGs have already been sharpened. And when we export our photographs, we'll do some additional sharpening then. So the sharpening we're doing now is really just to make up for any blurriness or lack of definition that resulted from the way our camera recorded the picture. Does that make sense to you? We can get some blurring in the detailed areas of our picture because of the way the camera prevents aliasing. So what we'll do is let's take a look at what the sliders do, and I'll try to explain what they're for. And remember, sharpening does not improve bad focus. I don't know why so many people think that, but if you have a part of your photograph that is out of focus, sharpening that area will sharpen the out of focusness. It will look sharply out of focus. So that's not what it does. What it does is adds that contrast to the edge. And fortunately, there is a really cool trick similar to what we did in split toning, where if you hold down the Option key or the Alt key or whatever it's called on a PC, when you use this slider, you'll see a luminosity preview. Let me do that. So when I click on the Control key and the slider and slide the slider to the right as the sharpening is being added, you will actually see it in the photograph. And it gets crunchy pretty quick. Let's focus on this brown pencil with all of the shavings. I've sharpened it there to 61, and I think that's overdoing it. Let's back it off a little. The default for sharpening raw images, what Lightroom will set as your sharpening, is a value of 25. And most of the time, that's fine. I would just leave it there. And in this case, 25, well, it's actually 40 now, but that looks pretty good. That's about as sharp as you would want. Now, radius defines how far from the edge of the pixel that is being sharpened, how far from that edge does the sharpening effect extend. And you've got values, I think, from nothing up to 3. Half is from 0.5 up to 3.0. And to see what this does, just hold down the Option key again. It'll give you a preview. Let's zoom in a bit more on this. Yeah, we'll do this one. Let's zoom in on that. Hold down the Option key and slide the radius button. And what you will see is the sharpening effect is extending further and further out from the edges of the pixels. Look on this edge, the left edge of this pencil, and you will see the radius increasing as I hold the Option key and slide to the right. You see the effect is getting larger and larger. What does it actually look like? Well, if you overdo it, you get weird color casts coming in, and you actually get less definition at the edges. So generally speaking, I leave that at its default of 1.0. Seldom do I find it very helpful. Sometimes in insect photographs where I have very, very fine detail that's overlapping, nudging the radius can help sharpen that a little bit. The third slider down in the sharpening panel is the detail slider. And this is going to accentuate the sharpening effect in the areas of the photograph that have more detail, which will rapidly make something like this pencil look very, very crunchy. See, in this groove where you have a lot of fine detail there, if we slide that slider to the left, all of that detail is smoothed out. It's much more subtle. But as we hold the Option key and slide that to the right, we see a lot of detail being added. And there's a sweet spot. And there's a matter of your own personal taste on how much sharpening you want. If you ever look at a photograph by somebody else that has been over sharpened, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. It doesn't look good. So I would certainly urge you to be gentle in your sharpening activities. Let's take that back to its default. I like the default of 25. It seems to work great. The last slider is the masking slider, and now this one is really useful. Using masking allows you to apply a hidden mask that you don't see to the photograph that prevents the sharpening being applied to the whole photograph. And what Lightroom does is it preferentially, as you move the slider to the right, it blocks out those areas that lack detail and generally speaking wouldn't benefit from sharpening anyway. So let me show you how it works. Hold down the Option key, slide the tab to the right, and when it's all the way to the left, there is no masking. It is not applying a mask, which means everything in the photograph is sharpened when you move the sharpening amount slider. So as we move the slider to the right, you'll see the mask appears, and the areas that are in white are being sharpened to the amount that you've specified in your amount slider, with your amount slider. But everything that is behind the mask isn't sharpened at all, and that can cause areas of the photograph that are masked out to look a little soft. So just bear that in mind. I think less is better when it comes to sharpening. So I, generally speaking, will slide this well to the right and leave only the edges and the details not masked. Okay guys, let's finish up with noise reduction. Noise is something that's introduced by the sensor on your camera. When you're shooting at higher ISOs, the camera introduces more of these artifacts. There's nothing you can do about it. And when you're processing your photographs, you can remove some, but you don't need to try to remove all of the noise, and sometimes you can leave quite a lot of noise in if your photograph looks good. So there are two areas under noise reduction. One is luminance and one is color. And normally, let's put that the way it normally is. So normally when you open the panel, the luminance slider is all the way on the left, the detail is at 50, and the contrast is at 0. And for the color is preset at 25, whereas the detail and smoothness are at 50. So that's the way it will look when you open it up. Another way that you can add noise is by over sharpening your photograph. So for the sake of this demonstration, I'm going to bump up the sharpening on this nighttime picture to induce both some color and some luminance noise, and then show you how we get rid of them. So let's zoom in to a dark part of the photograph. There you go. That shows it quite well. This is luminance noise right here. Now the way noise reduction works is Lightroom smooths the areas, which really means it blurs the areas. It adds blur in order to spread the noise out to make it look more uniform. So if we click on the luminance slider, or by the way, we can click on the numeric value on the right and then use the up and down keys to do this. I like doing it that way, actually. It's quite accurate. But we'll just use the slider for now. As I pull the slider to the right, Lightroom is blurring those areas with the noise, and the noise disappears. But in doing so, I have very much softened the photograph. And while it might not be immediately visible, if you zoom in, you're going to see that a lot of the detail has been softened in the process. And that's what these other sliders are for. The detail slider, which is normally set on 50, as you reduce the luminance and you introduce softness, you can use the detail slider to basically unsoften the areas of detail in the photograph. Similarly, the contrast slider will allow you to remove the blurring that has happened at points of contrast between light and dark and bring back the sharpness to that edge. So that's what the detail and contrast slider are for. Seldom would I recommend you reduce noise to that extent. I'm happy to live with a little bit of noise to maintain the sharpness of the overall picture. So let's look at color noise reduction. The idea is the same. The color is an artifact made by the sensor when it doesn't have enough information to accurately record the colors. You'll notice that the color slider is set at 25. That's its default value. And the reason is that 25 is about right to remove most color noise. So in order to see the color noise in this picture, I'm going to actually have to drop this slider back towards 0. And as I do, you can immediately see the color noise jumping out of all of these surfaces. Greenish, purplish, just a lot of ugly color that, again, might not be super apparent from a distance, but as you start to zoom in, you'll see it becomes distractingly horrible. So just putting the color noise reduction slider back to 25 and giving it the computer a second to catch up will get rid of most color noise. Now the detail and smoothness sliders are basically what they sound like. The detail will protect the higher frequency areas of the photograph, whereas the smoothness protects the lower frequency areas. Much the same as in the luminance adjustments. So that is really all there is to it. That's how you sharpen your photographs and how you remove noise. Remember that as you add noise reduction, you are unsharpening your picture. So sometimes you may do some sharpening adjustments, get deeper into the image, see some noise, remove the noise, and then when you look at the image again, it's no longer sharp or as sharp as you wanted it. So sometimes you have to go back to sharpening, bump up the sharpening, the radius or the detail just a little bit to get it back to where you want it. But that's all there is to it. Use them carefully and trust the preset values. They're usually pretty good. And just be aware of the fact that when you use higher and higher ISOs on your camera, you are going to be introducing more and more noise that you may or may not want to remove. So that's all there is for this day. Next time, we're going to get into the super cool tools in the toolbar. The filters, the crop tool, the red dot in the middle of the eye tool, and after that we'll get down into the lens corrections and geometry corrections panels at the bottom of the develop module, and that will just about finish it up for us when we get that done. So if you have any questions about how to sharpen, how to remove noise, or how to use the split toner, please don't hesitate to get in touch. I will answer your questions and make sure that you know exactly what you're doing. Other than that, if you would leave me a thumbs up or heck, subscribe to the channel, that would be just tremendously awesome. Yeah, I'll be back in a couple of days with the next one, and you will be a true Lightroom expert by next weekend if you keep up this pace. Have a good day, stay out of trouble, take lots of pictures, and good day.